answering. Okay, we'll begin with Perek Aleph, Pasuk Aleph, first verse of the book. Bereishit bara Elokim, eis hashamayim v'eis haaretz. That in the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth. And there's an interesting Ramban on this pasuk. It's the first Ramban on pasuk Aleph. Bereishit bara Elokim. Amar Reb Yitzchak, lo yitzarich lahaskal haTorah elo me'achodeshes Elochem. She mitzvah rishona shenitztavu bo Yisrael. The Ramban is citing Rashi. Rashi cites a medrash of Reb Yitzchak that says, you could make the argument that the Torah should begin with the mitzvah of HaChodesh Elochem. Excuse me for one moment. It's the first communal mitzvah the Jewish people were given. Umatam Pasach Bereishis. So why should the Torah begin with Bereishis, with the creation of the world? The Torah should have begun with the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. Now, just to clarify for a moment, the assumption of this question is that the purpose of the Torah is to give mitzvahs to the Jewish people. So if the purpose of the Torah is to give mitzvahs to the Jewish people, so begin with the first mitzvah given to the Jews as a people, which was the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh when they were still in Egypt. So therefore, the question is, Matam Pasach Bereishis. So why do we begin with the story of the creation of the world? Mishum Koach Ma'asav Yikid Lamo. Because of the idea of telling his nation, God wants to tell his nation the strength of his actions. Shim Yomru Umos Ha'olam. If the nations of the world were to come along and say, Listimatem, you're thieves, referring to the Jewish people. Shikivashtem Lochem Artzo Shiva Goyim. There were other nations that inhabited the land of Israel before the Jews came along. And the times of Yoshua, you came and you drove those other nations out. You're thieves. What if the nations and now you still live, now you've reclaimed the land of Israel. What if the nations of the world were to say that to the Jewish people? So we say, hey, Momrim Lahem, the Jewish people should say back, Kol ha'aretz shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All of the land belongs to God. V'nasna l'asher yashar be'einav. And God gave the land to whom he thinks should have the land. Ubirtsono nasna lahem. It was the will of God to initially give the land to these seven nations. Ubirtsono natlal mehem v'nasna lanu. And it was the will of God to take their land from them and to give it to us. And this is a medrash cited by Rashi. Obviously, on some level, this medrash still resonates with us today in a very significant way. So, even though it would have been logical to begin with the mitzvos, the Torah begins with the creation of the world to show God made the world, and therefore it's God's discretion as to who should be where in this world. We're just following God's mitzvah, God's plan, by living in Israel. That's Rashi. Says the Ramban, you could ask about this. What kind of question is this? Why should the Torah begin with Bereishis? It makes perfect sense for the Torah to begin with Bereishis. The idea that God created the world is the foundation of faith. Let's say a person comes to you and tells you, I accept all the commandments. I just don't buy into this thing that God created the world. I just don't buy that. What would you, so do you see me as a believing Jew? You would say, no, I don't see you as a believing Jew. It's very nice you like the commandments. You'll get reward for doing the mitzvos, but that's not the theology. The theology is that God created the world. So what kind of question is, why should the Torah begin with Bereishis? Vatshuva, the answer, says the Ramban, is Bereishis Sod Amuk. The story of the creation of the world is a deep secret. Eino Muvan Mina Mikros. It's not apparent from the Psukim. V'lo Yivoda Buryo El Mipia Kabbalah Ad Moshe Rabbeinu Mipia Gvura. We don't, there's so much about the creation of the world that we don't begin to understand. And there are certain aspects that are traditionally handed down by Moshe through the generations. That's only a small piece of it. V'yodav Chayavin Lahastiro. So if a person really understood everything, they're supposed to keep it secret because the average person can't grasp it all. The Kacham Reb Yitzchak, Shein Lascholas HaTorah Tzorech Bereishis Bara. So therefore, Yitzchak comes along and says, of course, the idea of God creating the world is important, But to begin with something that we don't even really understand, why should the Torah begin with something that we don't even really understand? Vasipur b'masheniver b'yom rishon, uma'anasa b'yom sheni u'shara yamim. The idea of this is created on the first day, this is created on the second day, these were created on other days. Va'arichos b'yitzirus Adam v'Chava, the great length discussing the creation of Adam and Chava, v'chatam, v'yansham, their sin, their punishment, v'sipur Gan Eden, v'girush Adam mimenu, the whole story of the creation of Gan Eden and Adam and Chava's being exiled from Gan Eden. You think we read Parshas Bereishit, we understand what any of this is really about? We have nuggets and pieces and midrash. We don't know what we're talking about. You think you understand the story of the flood? You think you understand the story of the Tower of Babel? And by the way, we think we understand this all just based on the Psukim. Why do we need to go into all this when we don't really get it? People who accept the truth of the Torah will be able to connect the Torah without these stories. We talk about it in the Ten Commandments, which of course would be very much included because the Ten Commandments are all about instructions that God gives us. In the mitzvah of Shabbos, it says because God created the world for 6 days and rested on the seventh. That would be our takeaway. That would be our talking point. And there will be people who have greater knowledge of things, will understand it in greater depth. Let that be the reference to the creation of the world within the context of our keeping Shabbos. So that, says the Ramban, is the question. And now Rabbi Yitzchak comes along and answers the question. Why should we begin with this? Why should we have this at all? All this detail that doesn't mean anything to us, doesn't mean a lot to us. The Torah begins with Bereishit, through the creation of humanity. And that God gave governance of the earth, of the creatures of this earth, to mankind. The Gan Eden, and Gan Eden, that was the choicest of places created in this world, and it was a place for people to be. Until God expelled Adam and Chava because of their sin. My gosh, the people of the flood, because of their sin, were killed. They were expelled from the earth altogether. And Noach was a tzaddik among them. He was saved and his family was saved. Vizaram, their offspring, their offspring in the story of the Tower of Babel, even though these people were saved and now they built humanity again, their offspring, because of their sin, were spread out among the earth. And they held on to different spots based on what they were able to get. It's a very interesting shot from the Ramban. You know what the lesson of Bereishit and the following parshos is? The lesson of Bereishit is this is a world of reward and punishment. And God rewards and God punishes. And for everything that God did for Adam and Chava at the beginning, because they sinned, they were expelled. And that's the story of the flood. And that's the story of the Tower of Babel. So we see that's the history of the world. Just because it's here today, just because you're here today, doesn't mean you'll be here tomorrow. And therefore, nations of the world come and say, how dare the Jews come into the land of Israel? We were here first. Okay, did you read the book of Bereishit? The book of Bereishit is all about the idea that you can't take things for granted. Yes, you were there first. But as we're told many times in the Chumash, the nations that were living in Israel were expelled because they did a lot of avodah zarah, idol worship. God wasn't happy with their conduct. And that's why he expelled them and gave us the land of Israel. And that all comes out from reflecting on the studies of the book of Bereishit. So that's the Ramban's perspective on this medrash cited by Rashi. Im Kain Roy, who it's appropriate, Kasher Yosef Agoy Lachto, when the nation continues to sin, Shiyovad Mimkomo, they should be destroyed from their place. V'yovo Goy Achel Bereishit Artzo, and another nation will come to inherit their land. Kichenu Mishpat Ve'Elokim Ba'aretz Me'olam, and that is the judgment of God in the land forever. V'kol shekain imam super bekasov kiknan mekulol v'nimkar levet olam. By the way, it follows in later psukim, right? Canaan, the son of Noah, acted in a disrespectful way to him, and his offspring are punished with becoming slaves. And therefore, Canaan won't inherit the choice places. Rather, those who serve God appropriately will inherit it. Okay. Skipping a few lines. Okay, we can hold here. It's a very, very interesting Ramban. I just want to add to this the Kli Yakar. If I remember correctly, I was trying to find it last night. I didn't successfully find it, but I believe it's the Kli Yakar who says that, because you could ask on this medrash whether that we take it at face value, whether we understand it a little more deeply, like the Ramban says. So let me get this straight. We're sitting with the nations of the world, and they say, why are the Jews in the land of Israel? And we pull out our book of Bereishit, and we read them the Ramban, and then they say, oh, wow, that's a really good point. Forget we ever asked the question. That's not going to happen. So I believe it's the Kli Yakar that says that it's essential that we remind ourselves of this. There's people will say to us, you're acting in an immoral way. You're taking other nations' land. We need to remind ourselves that this is God's world, and the fact that someone lived here once doesn't mean they're always going to live there, and our connection to the land of Israel is based on the instructions of God. So we discussed this famous medrash cited by Rashi, and we discussed the Ramban. Just press this.